In today's gaming landscape, there are plenty of games that include some form of environmental or elemental gameplay. Things like setting off a trap to take out a group of enemies, or using knowledge of a character's weakness to land a critical hit. Making these sorts of plays can be really satisfying, so it's not surprising that a lot of games incorporate these mechanics. However, when it comes down to actually playing these games, I find that most of these systems end up adding very little to the experience, and are often just ignored by the player. Take Skyrim for example. I played as a freeze mage, and focused on dealing damage with ice spells. I never knew that Draugr, ice wolves, and mammoths were all resistant to frost damage. It just wasn't that important. And it's the same for the environmental traps found in Diablo 3. I never really found myself using traps like rolling logs and falling chandeliers. Sure, they were fun to mess around with at the beginning, but eventually you just start to ignore them. Again, they just weren't that important. This is why I was pleasantly surprised to find that this was not at all the case for Divinity Original Sin 2. I was constantly thinking about elemental synergies and environmental hazards, and unlike other games, Divinity's mechanics were deep and useful, worth paying attention to. But why is this the case? What is it about Divinity's elemental combat that pushes it miles ahead of the competition? The difference is so stark that it almost looks like these other games aren't even trying. I was really curious about this seemingly massive gap in functionality, and wanted to find out why this was the case. I began to play lots of different games, with different takes on these systems, and started to put the pieces together. The key is that Divinity avoids a number of traps that other games fall into when attempting to highlight these mechanics. The hard part is creating a design that doesn't clash with everything else the game is trying to accomplish. Sure, you can create an effective system in a vacuum, but once you try to implement it, it will cause you a lot of problems if it contradicts with your other systems. This causes developers to reduce the impact of these mechanics until the problems go away. But by doing so, they gut the systems to the point where they're no longer relevant, and are destined to be ignored by the player. Divinity sidesteps this brilliantly, with a design that addresses these problems on a fundamental level. In this video, I'm going to go over some of these pitfalls, how many games end up falling to them, and how Divinity rises to the challenge. To start, let's look at elemental resistance mechanics. This is where enemies are resistant to certain elements, but weak to others. So, for example, a fire slug isn't bothered by a flame attack, but is seriously hurt by water. These type of systems incentivize players to choose their tactics carefully, and not just rely on one or two moves. You're not going to need your fire spells when battling those fire slugs, but they'll be pretty handy against other enemies. Divinity doubles down on this mechanic by making certain enemies completely invincible to their core element. These skeletons are completely unaffected by poison damage, and will even heal when standing in poison. This complete invulnerability ensures that players have to work around this obstacle. You can't simply muscle past and ignore it, like I often find myself doing in other games. So why don't more games do this? Why are resistance mechanics often so weak that they become a non-essential part of the experience? Well, it's because elemental resistances directly contradict with what many games are trying to accomplish. Let's take another look at Skyrim. The game is designed with a play how you want mindset that encourages players to build their characters in any way. Because the game needs to make sure that players can be successful with any strategy, enemies can't be invulnerable to a specific type of attack. My Freeze Mage wouldn't be a viable build if there were enemies that didn't take damage from frost. Resistances can never be more than a slight nuisance because the game isn't willing to force the players to adapt. So while Skyrim does include resistance mechanics, it isn't willing to commit to them, and intentionally leaves the door open for players who want to muscle past them. Divinity deals with this by giving you a party of 4, instead of just a single character. This gives you the freedom to build a character that specializes in a single element, as long as your party is balanced as a whole. Your Fire Mage isn't going to be the MVP when fighting a pack of fire slugs, but that's okay if the rest of the party can pick up the slack. And there are usually still ways to make a character useful when fighting a bad matchup. If you're fighting a group of enemies with different resistances, then you can have your Fire Mage target enemies that he can fight. And in a pinch, anyone is able to deal physical damage, even if it means unequipping your weapon and throwing a punch. But I think the best way the game lets you play around this is by using elemental combos to change the nature of your attacks. Because of the ways the elements interact with each other, it's often possible to find creative uses for skills. For example, areas of poison will light on fire if they come in contact with flames. This means that given the right situation, we can use a poison ability to deal fire damage. Here, we have a skeleton who is immune to poison but takes damage from fire. He's standing really close to some flames, so we can use a poison ability to spread the flames to reach him. By throwing a poison grenade that hits both him and the fire, we create a fire surface under him and deal some damage. Divinity's elemental resistance mechanics work because the developers have created counterplay against them. There's a careful balance between the tactics that work and the tactics that don't. This forces players to adapt to each encounter, and keeps the game fresh and challenging. Now, let's turn our attention to environmental mechanics, the things that affect the area you're fighting in. In Divinity, this includes barrels of oil or water, surfaces covered in flames or blood, and clouds of steam or poison. As you can see, Divinity includes a large number of effects that can dot the area you're fighting in, and you'll often find that the battlefield is absolutely painted with a bevy of different hazards. This is the first reason that Divinity's environmental mechanics work so well. While most games use environmental hazards as small diversions that pop in and out every once in a while, Divinity brings these effects into the core of the experience, and forces you to think about the environment with every move you make. Almost every ability is designed to impact the environment in some way. Fire spells leave behind a patch of scorched earth, lightning spells electrocute puddles of water, and ice spells create slippery slicks. The game rarely forces you to choose between dealing direct damage and impacting the environment, instead making it possible to do both at the same time. Even non-elemental abilities can impact the environment. Hitting certain enemies with physical attacks will create pools of blood, and certain physical abilities have secondary effects, like clearing environmental hazards. Last, certain abilities utilize the environmental effects that already exist to change what the ability does. The Conjure Incarnate spell creates a minion for the player to control that will be different depending on which surface it summons onto. If you need a burst of damage, you can summon it onto a fire surface to create a minion that can shoot a fireball. But if you need some support to keep your team alive, you can summon onto a water surface to create a minion that can heal. Divinity's environmental mechanics are incredibly complex and encourage the player to consider them at every turn. But unfortunately, this isn't exactly the norm. Many games have environmental systems that feel shallow or tacked on, systems that don't integrate into the rest of the design and feel like an afterthought. To illustrate this, let's take a look at Diablo 3 and its use of environmental traps. These are hazards placed throughout the game that can be set off by the player. They sound cool in theory, but in practice, they end up having fairly little use. They might stun enemies in an AoE or deal some damage, but they aren't going to be the difference between winning and losing a fight. The problem is that these traps don't synergize with anything else that Diablo is about. They're set off by a switch or a breakable block, and have no relationship to the 6 ability combat that the game revolves around. At the end of the day, these traps are just a gimmick. A cheap throwaway mechanic with no more depth than do action A to get result B. In contrast, Divinity ensures that there are tons of interactions between the environmental mechanics and the core actions your characters can take. The environmental hazards respond dynamically to your abilities, and become a seamless part of the core gameplay experience. Take this barrel of oil, for example. Unlike the chandelier from Diablo, it responds differently to different actions. You can hit it with a physical attack to spill the oil, hit it with a fire attack to cause an explosion, teleport it to spill the oil somewhere else, and pick it up to place it somewhere else. The barrel of oil is not just a cute gimmick, but a fundamental extension of the game's core mechanics. It fits in with what the player is already doing, and becomes a natural part of the gameplay. As it turns out, making games with epic elemental magic, devious traps, and fire-resistant beasts is a lot harder than it sounds. There are a whole host of problems that these mechanics can create, and unless you address those problems directly, your game won't be as fun as it sounds. Divinity handles these mechanics with the respect they deserve, highlighting what makes them great while carefully working around their drawbacks. It isn't an easy task, which explains why it remains unmatched by its peers. But I hope that we see more games that learn from Divinity's success. Because, to put it bluntly, Divinity is awesome. Thanks so much for watching to the end of the video. If you like what you heard, then consider subscribing for more video game analysis. I'm really loving Divinity 2 right now, so I'm looking to make a bit more content on the game. Let me know if you're interested in this, or just let me know what you want to see in the future. See you next time.